Hello, my name is Maddie Whittle. I'm a member of the programming team at Film at Lincoln Center and one of the co-programmers of our live talks series throughout the year. And it is my pleasure to welcome you for this special in-depth conversation about Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, a brand new 4-part documentary series that aired on HBO on April 7th and 8th. And if you're watching this with us on YouTube, the series is now available to stream in its entirety on HBO Max. It's an expansive, visually arresting examination of the history of European settler colonialism from Africa to the Americas, tracing its impact on society through the darkest hours of humanity. For this conversation, we're very pleased to be joined by the filmmaker, Raoul Peck, whose 2016 documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, about James Baldwin, was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 89th Academy Awards and screened in the New York Film Festival when it was new. And we also hosted it for a record-breaking run in Film at Lincoln Center theaters upon its release. So we're really excited to welcome Raoul back for this new conversation discussing his new work. He will be joined by Roxanne Dunbar-Oritz, an activist, historian, and writer whose book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, is one of the core texts that inspired Exterminate All the Brutes. She's Professor Emerita of Ethnic Studies at California State University, Hayward. We're also joined by Mahmood Mamdani, who's a scholar specializing in the study of African history and politics. He's the executive director of the McCreer Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda, and the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government in the Departments of Anthropology and Political Science at Columbia University. The conversation will be moderated by our own Eugene Hernandez, the director of the New York Film Festival, deputy executive director of Film at Lincoln Center, and publisher of Film Comment. Finally, I want to make a special shout out and thank you to HBO, especially Nancy Abraham and Lisa Heller, for partnering with us on this special in-depth conversation that we're now presenting on YouTube. So thank you all so much for joining us, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Eugene Hernandez from Film at Lincoln Center and the New York Film Festival. The last time we saw Raoul Peck in our theaters, I was at the New York Film Festival a few years ago, and we are thrilled to be able to share his latest work with you and to talk about it today. We have some terrific guests who are going to share with us a conversation about this exceptional series, Exterminate All the Brutes, an HBO series airing in the States. And we invite you, some of our audience will have had a chance to watch a couple of episodes, and we invite you to see the entire series on HBO. And for those in other parts of the world tuning in, we invite you to check it out where it's available to you as well. Raoul, welcome back to Film at Lincoln Center in a little bit of a different way.
Thank you for inviting me again.
We're always thrilled at the opportunity to sit down and talk with you, and in particular today about this new work. And we'll dig into that in just a moment. Raoul, where are you joining us from today?
From Paris.
Okay, welcome from Paris.
With my company.
Great, welcome from Paris. We're also joined by Roxanne Dunbar-Oritz. For those who have watched these first 2 episodes, or when you do, you will hear about the influence of her work in this piece, and perhaps you're already, if you're watching this, you may already be familiar with her work. Welcome, Roxanne. Where are you joining us from yourself?
Thank you, Eugene. I'm in San Francisco, California.
Very good. My home state. Hello to California. And from another side of the globe, joining us as well, and we're really looking forward to talking with you as well, Mahmood Mamdani. Tell us where you are. I know where you are, but tell us where you are.
I'm in Kampala, Uganda.
Very good.
Practically on the equator.
Well, one of the things that there's so much that's been disrupted, but if there's one positive outcome of our gathering in this kind of a forum on Zoom, it's that we can have people join us from all over the world who may not be able to make the trip to New York to sit on our stage, although we always love to have you on our stage, and we invite you back to Lincoln Center when we're reopened. So this is an open invitation, but this will have to suffice for today. Thank you very much for being here. So, Raoul, why don't we start the easy way, and that is to help our audience understand the origins of this this series. If you don't mind, and you've talked a little bit about this, but I think it would help our audience sort of get a foundation in what drew you to this topic now. And also, I want to ask you in a moment about the structure, making it as a film, making it as a series, how those kinds of formats allow you different kinds of creative freedom. So we'll talk about that in a moment, and we'll talk about weaving in the work of those represented on screen here, Mahmood and Roxanne. We'll talk about some of the other collaborators as well.
Most of my film are not, do not come from one idea that I have one day. It's always the result of a long process. And I can say probably my whole life. But more specifically, after the airing of my previous film, I Am Not Your Negro, I felt that I've done my job. For me, Baldwin words meant everything. There is nobody who could phrase the deep problems of particularly the United States regarding racism, regarding the foundation of the Republic, regarding injustice, etc., regarding violence. And I thought, well, the way Baldwin framed it, there is nothing else to add to it. And if you still can't understand what is to be done in this republic, then I lose all hope, because it cannot be clearer said and more convincingly said than Baldwin had done. So, but with the film, I travel a lot. I went to a lot of US university. I went to a lot of European capital. Basically, the film went around the world. And it dawned on me that, that the deeper scope of this conversation cannot be assessed until we go back to the source of all of it. How do we pinpoint where is the origin of this Eurocentric mind? When did it start really to impress our stories? And how do you explain how we got there? And I needed to do it in a way that would be comprehensible for a wider audience. I'm sure a scholar like Mahmood or Roxanne, they can say that they have written many books trying to do that same job. But my task was almost as, how can I be the best vulgarizator of those thoughts and reflection and studies and discoveries. And so it was, although I was exhausted from the work on the Baldwin piece, which also was fueled by I can say the 40 years prior. So you don't make a film just starting making it. The whole ideas are already more or less there. And I can say the same for this particular film. The only thing I didn't have is the approach of it, the instrument to it. And it was a chance discovery of Sven Lindqvist's book, Exterminate All the Brutes, that it dawned on me. There is a way to tell this story, and there is a way to tell it in all its different point of views, and all these fundamental and structural ways that make no mistake, and that make the subject totally understandable. And Sven succeeds really in doing that, and he does it as an incredible writer and a writer of stories. And of course, in terms of cinema, it was the perfect tool to use. And throughout the work on that with Sven, and I met Sven several times. I went to to Sweden to meet him, to spend time with him, to have discussion, to read all his books, and we really became friends. And at some point, I realized that if I am going to go back to the source and the American continent part of the story, I also need solid background. I also need somebody that would be as reliable to me as Sven was, which was Roxanne, and who had, of course, I don't need to emphasize more, the incredible importance of her work, and also, I was thinking just before this meeting that for some reason these people that I feel very close to me are people who also have in their personal life a multicultural approach to the world. They have pushed back from the start the whole Eurocentric view of the world. And I think that's a key element to even start to understand what's going on today in our world. And this is a phenomenon that I'm seeing more and more in the work of scholars and the work of writers as well. The abandonment of the usually very Eurocentric, even when you were coming from the third world, the so-called third world, for a Senegalese writer or a Haitian writer for many, many years, it was important to be edited in Paris, and for others, in London. And we, in the last 40 years, I can say there were writers before that who tried to evade that matrix, but the last, I would say, 20, 30 years were extremely innovative in that sense, that maybe it's where history have brought us. We are now in the capacity to not only see that, but also that we have the instrument and we also have some sort of power to be able to do that. And so as usual, I gave you a very long answer, but it was the idea to set up the whole discussion about how this film came about. But I will be able to give you more insight later.
I'm dwelling on this statement that you've made around this notion of a Eurocentric approach. We could talk about that Eurocentrism as it relates to academia, to history, to the arts. And I wonder if we see a change happening, I wonder if that, I also want to think about where that centrism comes from. And I wonder if part of it comes from how all of you respond to this question of whether it comes from seeking validation, that the validation that might come from a work being edited in Paris or edited in London, or a film being accepted or invited or funded from a European source.
Well, it's not so much
from a validation, seeking a validation.
It's not so much about some sort of subjective feelings about it. It's just a power situation. It's simple. The so-called winners of this incredible conquest, they are the ones who dictate who belong and who do not belong. And of course, your reaction is to go to the center and try to validate, not in the sense that, the Holy Master will validate your work, but if you want to have influence and impact, it's almost natural, to do that. And what have happened those last 20, 30 years, and also about the explosion of media as well, and the explosion of media instrument through numerical technology, the power grip is less, totalitarian, and at the same time also history have evolved. The fact that most African countries became independent in the 60s we are now in the process of seeing them, looking for their real place in the world. It's from the 60s to today, it's a very short time. So all of this process, basically the decolonization process everywhere, from North to South Africa, in Latin America, from the neocolonialism to all the right wings regimes, the dictatorships in Latin America, toward a more progressive development, etc. So I don't want to vulgarize too much those processes, but it's not about just from our side to looking for validation. It's about a very clear power structure. When Trouillot said naming is power, basically the Eurocentric school of thought basically named everything. The very language even we are using is tainted by that. Our whole history, our point of view is biased from the get-go. And Roxanne and I'm going to let you guys say something about that. Anything you can say about American history, if you don't from the start recognize the genocide of Native American and slavery of the Africans, you can't tell that story. Your story is biased. So that's the bottom line. So my work was that, how do I go to the bottom of this?
Roxanne, thank you, Raoul. Roxanne, in a chapter of this film, Raoul raises this question. The whole series interrogates and attacks, questions, challenges so many of the ideas and questions that Raoul just laid out for us. But as it relates to the history of indigenous peoples in our own country for a moment, in the US for a moment, this is a moment in Raoul's film where he talks about Howard Zinn, he talks about your work, and he introduces your history, the history that you've been exploring and that is presented in your book, Indigenous Peoples' History, the United States. I want to give you an opportunity to illuminate some of what Raoul is saying, but also, if you don't mind, I invite you to connect it to this collaboration for this piece, adapting so much of what you've been exploring, studying, questioning for this specific, this conversation in this film specifically.
Well, what Raoul said about the Eurocentrism and trying to, in the history field that I'm in, to write against the narrative, the origin narrative of the United States, born as an anti-colonial entity, fighting off British colonialism, making a white settler state into a colony of Europe. People actually believe that, and if you don't include that in the professional history field that I'm trained in, you don't get jobs, you don't get published and peer-reviewed, within the academy. My Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States was not reviewed in a single American historical journal, in the peer-reviewed journals, not one. It's done very well. I wrote it for the people, and not for historians, but it's changed somewhat, but there's still pretty much this core that you have to relate to somehow and justify, or you're simply expressing opinions, no matter how much documentation, you're cherry picking. So these are the terms of my trade. And I think in film, in arts, exactly the same, the same thing happens in a different way. And so I think what I tried to do in my book, and what Raoul has translated incredibly, to film is get to that heart of darkness, of colonialism, and find its origins, the ethnic cleansing of Iberia in 1492, the cleanliness of blood requirement to be Spanish. This then is the basis of the other France, Britain, the Dutch. Their colonialism was built on those concepts and a racial order. Race was invented at that moment, that cleanliness of blood, the Catholic Church. So, and a inquisition to investigate that. It was a legalized process, not just a cultural practice. So getting to those roots, I think people avoid it. Artists sometimes avoid it, historians, simply because then, well, what can we do if it's that deep and that old, and that we can't do anything without it, actually. But people have a lot to lose if they lose the Eurocentrism. It's just shocking to see Macron and the French acting like Donald Trump, introducing his 1776 curriculum in his last days as president. It's like this liberal, France is doing the same thing. And of course, blaming us in the United States for infecting the French, the colonized people who are in France, of having ideas that are not Eurocentric. So it's not easy to when there are literally state-sponsored punishments for they're subtle, you're not hung now usually, or executed, but it's still a very powerful suppression. So when Raoul approached me, well into his work on the film, to include the United States, and I think it was such an important gesture, because I always work on this dual track of what all of colonialism. I did my graduate work in history at UCLA. Fortunately, at that time, they had developed area studies. So we had ANC people, exiled South Africans studying there. I was able to learn about settler colonialism, also Palestinians. I was able to learn about it, and they would tell me it's just like that in the United States. That's who I learned from in the 1960s. And I was very lucky, because not everyone has access to, and it was only accidental that I did. But it became the foundation of my understanding then of the United States. Is I was told, look at this, look around you. It's settler colonialism. It's just like the Boers. It's just like the Zionists. And so I think Raoul putting all this together, it's the very first time that the United States has been included in any study of colonialism, in documentary, in history. So it's a really a breakthrough that, and then Mahmood, who's here with us, has done the same thing in his book that came out last year. So I really feel optimistic. I think this film, Mahmood's book, my work, and others who are doing this, that people are really hungry for the truth, I think, ultimately, especially young people. And it really is liberating to put all, be able to put all this together and say, aha, now I understand.
Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you for that detailed answer. I really appreciate it. And you nodded to Mahmood, so I'm going to invite him to join the conversation. Mahmood, I'm assuming that Roxanne's referring to Neither Settler Nor Native, your 2020 book. How are you thinking about some of these questions as it relates to the context of the film that Raoul's been exploring? And maybe you can elaborate on some of the work you're doing now or have been doing the past few years that's salient to this topic specifically.
Well, I actually want to first just establish a continuity with what Roxanne was saying, and then comment on Raoul's film. And the point of continuity is the story of Eurocentrism. See, many civilizations have been ethnocentric. The Chinese civilization has been ethnocentric. They thought of their own world as the Middle Kingdom, and the Middle Kingdom is the center of the world. But ethnocentrism is not the same as the centrism we describe as Eurocentrism, because Eurocentrism is built on two propositions. One is a history not only of Europe, but a history of the world. A history of the world in which Europe appears as a standalone civilization. Europe needs nothing from the outside. It is completely self-sufficient, and it is able to sort of resource and nurture itself right from, the claim is, Europe begins in Greece. But that claim is a bogus claim. Because this story of Greece as the foundation of European civilization is a story invented in the 18th century. I asked my students here in Kampala at Makerere University, so they read Aristotle and Plato, and I say to them that when you read Aristotle and Plato, just make a notation of the places they refer to in their text, and notice that none of these places belong to what we today consider as Europe. These places are all around the Mediterranean. They are in Egypt, they are in Persia, they are in North Africa. Greece is not a European civilization. Greece is a Mediterranean civilization. But the story of Europe as self-sufficient starts with this fiction that Greece was a European civilization, and then goes on to completely erase from the picture the story of slavery, Atlantic slavery, and the industrialization, the centrality of Atlantic slavery in the industrialization of the West. This centrism is not just about ethnocentrism, it's about a hierarchy of civilizations. And that is then embodied in a theory called race. As Roxanne has just explained, race is invented in Iberia. The Philip is the Inquisition. And if you let me, I want to say something about how Raoul's film relates to this, because Raoul's film makes us change our vantage point. It retells the story. It retells the American story, first of all, by joining the story of the American Indian with the story of the African slave. That's very important because these two stories have always been told separately. Then what it does is it connects the story of the colonization of Ireland with the colonization of North America through kind of almost biographical details of the foot soldiers, the Scots-Irish. And then I think more importantly, it now takes us to the moment, the antidote, the resistance, the beginning of the attempt to change this world. And therefore, the centrality of the Haitian Revolution of 1892 is the trigger of a story of emancipation. Now, it retells this, but it has huge repercussions for how we begin to see the world itself, because it forces us to examine the stories that we have just sort of embraced and swallowed. Well, I was very excited, even though my internet connection was not great, but I managed to see all the episodes, and I congratulate Raoul for really reaching out to a huge audience with a story that has never been told on film.
Raoul, this is strong praise, but it's certainly not praise that you can prepare for or anticipate as you're channeling and shaping is the word I'm actually looking for, as you're shaping what we're ultimately going to see told over multiple episodes. There are certainly, as a filmmaker, you have available to you different templates. You have extended feature-length film presentation, a context that is related to feature film. You have an episodic format that you can weave together. You're also using what critics might call, or film teachers might call, a hybrid approach, because you're weaving in not only a personal narrative with your own footage, with your own narration, with archival and documentary footage, but also acted scenes. Josh Hartnett as the everyman in many ways in different contexts. So I'm asking you, as we kind of go deeper into the filmmaking and that shaping, that honing that you as an artist are doing here, how you thought about the different levers that you could pull creatively to now contain, but also to invite an exploration from your audience into so much of what Roxanne and Mahmood are talking about, and what you've been exploring in the topics that you're pursuing here.
Well, first of all, I have to again emphasize how I really stand on the shoulder of people like Roxanne and Mahmood and some other scholar and writers, and all of them who have nurtured me during all those years. And the second thing is, watching Roxanne and Mahmood speaking, one key difference for me, and that is very important for the organic way I approach my work, is that you could see bodily how concerned they were. It's about their life. It's about people they know. It's about, human being. And that cannot be just some esoterical university work or academic reflection. It's about life. It's about real people. And to come back to your question about how to do it, it's again, the explanation is also organic for me. I come from a country, Haiti, who have been independent since 1804, and who have seen the world past its accomplishment, which was to stop slavery on its track against 4 and 5 of the most powerful countries on earth. And that those same countries passing in front of them and going to Africa to colonize as if nothing happened. And people like me, like myself, who have access to instrument, to filmmaking, as an example. The film I make, I don't have a whole bibliothèque at my disposal, a whole set of images of 400 years of images of 500 or 600 years, the only images I have are the same image of the colonial power. So the only way for me to deal with that was to free myself and tell myself, you know what? I'm going to use whatever material that lands on my hands, and I will deconstruct it. I will turn it around. I would use, it's like a jiu-jitsu movement. You know, you have better tools than me, then I will use your tools. And this is what explains as well the approach of this film in terms of its aesthetic, in terms of its structure, in terms of its montage, the content. It's only because I gave myself the freedom to say, you know what, I don't have the image, I'm going to invent it. I don't have the footage, I'm going to have a good drawer draw me those images. The photos, there is a discipline to it too. You will see most of the photos, I use people watching the camera. Because if they don't, you're going to show them as victim. And I don't want to show them as victim. I don't want to perpetrate the images that we have been fed all those years. You know, you can see all the European art, all the European literature. You know, we have been nourished, we as well, because we were educated mostly in Western style universities. So we were, you know, we were nurtured by that too. So the deconstruction goes all the way. So I have to find my own instruments. I have to deconstruct the instrument that I was taught with and question everything. You know, that's the other thing that gave me a lot of freedom, is that once you understand how that story started and how far back, you know, you feel liberated to attack anything, you know, because you can't lecture me anymore. You know, I believe in what you taught, and they are obviously false or biased or inexact. So that's where I draw the strength and the approach of what I do.
It's a powerful thing you've just said. I think it translates to the audience as the one sole audience member on this panel who wasn't involved in the ideas or the creation of it, but has lived a life impacted by so much of what you're exploring. I think that word you used a moment ago, of it's liberating to have the opportunity to question, interrogate, explore so much of what you're each talking about here. And the impact of that is something we can't predict, but it can be profound on the art form, first of all, on the academy, certainly, on you know, the kinds of history that we receive or allow ourselves to receive, or the questions we ask in considering and exploring that history. And that's really my next question. It's about impact. It's about let me ask Roxanne and Mahmood for a moment, because it wouldn't be fair to ask the artist to consider or to predict the impact of his or her work. But I felt it the first time around in watching this series, and I look forward to watching it again. And you know, how many times did I pause and take something in and restart and pause? And I think that watching it the way we all have on a streaming platform or on a screener allows us to do that. But how do you, Roxanne, first, this question of impact and the influence that this piece can and hopefully will have in so many different sectors. How do you think about the impact it could have or the impact it should have?
Yeah, I think it will have an enormous impact. It's not just a one-off moment of showing, like say a stage play. It will be there forever as a artifact. So I think that it will shift when people are watching it. There'll be a shift in consciousness simply because of the I don't know, the film terms for it, but the style, the lack of the normal narrative of chronology, which I have to fight with all the time, because it can seem like something just from the distant past that has no importance at this time. And this constant going back and forth in time is one element that I think will jar people's mind into, thinking more deeply about, what it is, how they can get a grasp of that. So that just as it's made, and of course, I think now Raoul himself has a much broader viewership and audience other than us, people who've always known his work and liked it, learned from it with the Baldwin, I'm Not Your Negro, sort of breaking through in a way that the other films haven't, but I think it's taken people back to watch the other films and also look forward to the films that follow. So the film that struck me the most, and just I've tried to get everyone to watch, is I think it was, well, Raoul can say, but I think it was one of his early documentaries, if not the first, Lumumba, Death of a Prophet. And I thought what was powerful about that, so many things, but especially bringing his own story into it. I think that doing that in this new film is really important. I think he resisted it. Was from the last time we met, he was still looking and thinking about who to have as a narrator. So I think that's very, very important in the new film. And I had seen that in that earlier film, how powerful it was, connecting up his own story with, the more abstractions of how colonialism works. So I think it's so powerful. It's like 4 hours instead of the 1 hour, like the Lumumba, Death of a Prophet, so that people get, and of course it's about the whole world and European colonialism. So it's hard to predict. I know in my own book, sometimes people's reactions think they love the book, but not for reasons that I intended sometimes. So you can't predict everyone, but I think this film is so, you might say, unrelenting, sort of like the 3 books that Raoul used. I think we're all very unrelenting in our thesis. And that's something you don't see often enough in the United States, except, with some you know, off the wall kinds of things, but something that is truly educational. So yeah, I think it will have, I mean, I know it will have a big impact, and not just immediately, but for, you know, the next decade. I think it will be just really make substantial changes in people's thinking and hopefully actions.
I think there are two sides to this question. One is what Roxanne has put forth eloquently. It's that side is the film itself, and the maker of the film, the power with which the story is told, the compelling honesty with which the story is told, and the credibility of the storyteller, the director, and therefore an audience that Raoul has already built and that is eagerly awaiting his new work. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is the larger context, the context in which the film is coming out, because the world is changing. The world is changing within and without. It's changing in the US. You saw it with just over the last 5 years with Trump and the recent election. It's changing with a changing demography within the US, and it's changing with immigration is becoming one of the key issues within the US, and there is a growing minority, now no longer a minority, but multiple minorities, which together become a plurality, who, at least whose children are looking for a new way to understand the world. And the world is and the world is changing outside the US too. We are no longer in a unipolar world. We are in at least a multipolar world. We are in a world where there is contestation for who will lead the world, whose story will be the credible story, whose vision will be a compelling vision. And at such times, a space opens up. And Raoul is in that, making the most creative use of that space. And the other question I was asking myself is look, we have a studio like HBO, which is bringing this, and that itself is testimony to how much the world is changing. Something that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago is happening now. Thank you.
If I may say something about the question, of course, I want, out of my experience, I always say my film, and each film is, I make it the best I can, and I make it as well with the conscience that it might be my last film. And that attitude is very important because it helps you not to do any compromise. And as far as the impact is concerned, that's my whole history. I used to say, well, I make film not so much for now, but for the generation later, who someday might need some instrument for their own fight. Because sometimes the mountain is so huge, the mountain of ignorance, the mountain of propaganda, the mountain of false narrative, it's the media world as it is now, and how it has been building. The way people are glued to their phone and not to a book, the lack of time, to do deeper work, etc., etc. The place of consumption in our lives today. all this doesn't make it easy for complex issue to be understood, especially when our world have become even more complex, and more global. It's one world, one history. But the response to that is even, on one side, very tribalistic. Everybody has his own little chapel. And on the other side, very superficial because of lack of time, because of lack of interest, etc. So the voice, if I may call it like this, of the film is trying to lay down a sort of matrix that can enable whoever is ready to indulge in it or to confront it, to use it for further work or for further imagination or further discussion. And that's how I don't think I seek any immediate impact. On the contrary, I think that there will, of course, be the usual suspect to probably attack the film, not in its overall discourse, but in a lot of points, because I am confronting very different audiences in this film that have never been put together in front of the whole story. So there will be almost a natural reaction of some quarters, to say, well, I don't want to mix too much with that crowd, or this is not totally true because my own story. No, that's the attempt of this film is exactly to confront each other with what we have thought to be different stories. But there is no different stories. There is one story of this planet. And we need to see and accept and use each aspect of that planet. That's the only way to deal with it and to deal with its complexity.
The series we're discussing today is Exterminate All the Brutes. As we're recording this, that deeper conversation has yet to happen because we're recording this prior to the film being released. But if you're listening to or watching this now, it's because you've watched all or part of this remarkable series. You as an audience member and as our audience member from Film at Lincoln Center have an opportunity to share and invite those in your communities and networks to experience this work of art and also this conversation that we've had today. And that was really our intention, is to illuminate and add hopefully some context to a work that certainly stands on its own, but will be inviting greater conversation, greater exploration for a time to come. I can only again speak as one audience member on this panel, but I know it already will and has for me and for the people that I will invite to experience it. So thank you to Roxanne Dunbar-Oritz. Thank you to Mahmood Mamdani. Thank you to Raoul Peck for returning to our stage, our virtual stage at this time at Lincoln Center. Congratulations on this work and to this collaboration, to all of you for your work as well. And just thank you for spending this hour plus with us to talk today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.